Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Indigenous Entrepreneurs Network. My name is Loa Fridvinson of Activate Corporate Relations and Training, and I get the pleasure of interviewing Indigenous entrepreneurs and other experts working in the field of Indigenous business who are up to big things in the world. So today, I'd like to introduce you to my new friend, Sherman, who is the Business Development and Industry Engagement Manager at AMIK, Inc. AMIK's head office is in Manitoba, and what they do is offer turnkey solutions for the Indigenous community and corporate Canada in the areas of Indigenous job board, recruitment and retention, cultural sensitivity, and smart work ethics training. Try saying that 3 times fast. So Sherman, thank you so much for being here today with us.
Thank you very much for having me, Loa.
And I'm really looking forward to getting your insights on the topic of procurement, which I know to be a very hot topic in today's day and age, with the Indigenous communities working a lot more with corporate Canada and vice versa. And I know there's a lot of cases where it's working really well, but then there's also still some pretty significant challenges that people are working through. So can you tell me from your perspective, maybe just give our audience a little bit of an idea about your background and what you do at AMIK, and then if you can tell us what you've seen in the areas of procurement, what works, what doesn't work?
Sure. So AMIK, which has been around for, I want to say, around about 15, 20 years now, is a company that was founded here in Manitoba. It's 100% Indigenous owned and operated by Eva Wilson-Fontaine and her husband, EJ Fontaine. And what started out originally as Canada's first Indigenous job board has since morphed into quite a comprehensive range of services to help bridge the gap between the Indigenous community, primarily job seekers, and corporate Canada. So the core services that AMIK offers, such as cultural awareness training, recruitment and retention services of Indigenous people, and the retention services we refer to as cultural support, the soft skills training that we've brought in from the States, the special projects department, the temporary workers from the Indigenous side of things. These services were all kind of born from the feedback that we received from corporate Canada, where they basically said, you know, if there was an organization out there that could help facilitate these kind of services, it would be greatly appreciated for reconciliation. And so that is now what AMIK has become known for. And while we are based here in Manitoba on the Swan Lake Urban Reserve, the scope of work that we do is national. So, you know, a large part of this came from, you know, the calls to action, reconciliation. And in light of the history of Indigenous people in Canada and how they were wronged in so many ways, and in this particular case, you know, I'm speaking specifically about Call to Action 92, right, which is specific to corporate Canada. Reconciliation, I think, has been a really good thing because it promotes the spirit of working together, right? And it's really for a brighter future for everyone. So I think this is important because, as everyone knows, the Indigenous community is the fastest growing demographic in the country. I think everybody is relatively familiar with that whole concept. And so that is important because employment for this group is going to be absolutely essential for a variety of socioeconomic reasons, right? So something that is encouraging is the fact that perhaps at no other time, you know, Canada's business community is, with respect to Indigenous relations, procurement, so on and so forth, perhaps at no other time has been more open to Indigenous engagement strategies, right? So this presents a multitude of opportunities in a variety of different fields with respect to employment for Indigenous people. So I'll give you some examples. So our recruitment project with Air Canada saw us recruiting Indigenous flight attendants primarily for 3 different locations: Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto. We were also, on behalf of Air Canada, recruiting Indigenous candidates for customer sales and service agents in the airports and station attendants. With our current project with CN Rail, not only are we recruiting for conductors, rail track maintainers, car mechanics, laborers, but essentially any other job that is available with CN nationally. With the Assiniboine Credit Union, we were hiring bank tellers. With Canada Life, it was claims processors and examiners. So the willingness on behalf of the business community to engage, it also creates a positive environment for Indigenous entrepreneurs, not just the job seekers. Right. So with respect to the procurement of, be it products or services, especially when you consider how common it is these days to see Indigenous engagement sections in RFPs, right? So there's benefits for both the corporation or whomever is bidding on a certain project, and for potential Indigenous entrepreneurs to be that missing link.
Right.
Right. So yeah. I guess something else I would say is for corporations. I mean, oftentimes, while it might not necessarily be voiced, the business case can be a factor. Right?
Very true.
When it comes to contemplating whether or not an Indigenous engagement strategy is a worthwhile endeavor. Now, there are certainly some businesses out there that, let's say, might not have an understanding of how an Indigenous engagement strategy would benefit their business. And this could be very unintentional. It's just perhaps a lack of awareness, right? It's a different ball of wax.
Right.
And after all, if they're a for-profit business, they have to look out for their bottom line. Right?
Of course.
And so as a MIC, if we are asking the business community to be sensitive to Indigenous people, we also have to be sensitive to the fact that we're speaking to them as a business, right? So it's a two-way street. And it has to be a two-way street for reconciliation to work. So, for instance, an example that we often use is in the financial services sector. So let's say, hypothetically, that we're speaking with a financial institution and they're questioning whether or not, an Indigenous engagement strategy is a worthwhile endeavor. So we would say, okay, well, I wonder if we can maybe speak their language to help them understand why it would be beneficial for them in a purely business sense.
Right.
So we'd say, okay, as a financial institution, as a for-profit business, what are you always looking for? You're looking for deposit accounts, credit cards, lending, mortgages, investment dollars, so on and so forth, right? Now, if you're not gonna steal those clients from another bank or financial institution, or find new markets for growth, what do you have left, really, right? Like those are 2 main, tactics. So what we say is, look, as I mentioned earlier, the Indigenous demographic being as robust as it is in terms of size and growth and whatnot. If we assume that as each year goes by, more and more Indigenous people get post-secondary education and or training.
Right.
And more companies are looking to hire as part of, Call to Action 92 Indigenous people. That would suggest, at least in theory, a shift of this very fast growing population into the middle class, which is earning an income that is going to need not only products and services, but financial services, right?
Sure. And that goes for not only people whose middle class is being raised by the ultimately by the reconciliation and how corporations and Indigenous communities are working together, but there's going to be a larger number of entrepreneurs, Indigenous entrepreneurs looking for financial services as well.
Exactly, right? So, I mean, at the end of the day, basically what, that conversation looks like at the tail end is we say, even if you got a slice of that pie, it would be huge. It would be noticeable, right? And to your point, not only to the personal side of the financial institution, but also for the commercial side with the entrepreneurs, right? Be it small business or large. And so now it can also be just as simple as a company doing work in and around an Indigenous community, right? So we've seen blockades and protests against certain projects, which cause delays, which equal a loss in revenue, potential damage to a company's brand, negative effects on any negotiations, so on and so forth, right? So an Indigenous engagement strategy can be very beneficial for a variety of reasons, to include, proactive measures to mitigate potential risks, financial or otherwise. Most of the times it's financial in some way, shape, or form anyway. But at the end of the day, the question you really have to ask yourself as a company is, can you afford not to have an Indigenous engagement strategy? So that was kind of my long-winded way of saying, Indigenous engagement is beneficial for job seekers, potential or existing Indigenous entrepreneurs, and companies. But everyone has to work together, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's been the challenge in many cases with coming together, is because we're coming from very different worlds. In many cases, a lot of corporate Canada doesn't really understand the Indigenous perspective, and vice versa. So it's really important, especially as we all move forward together as Canadians, to grow our nation, is that we do, the old saying by Stephen Covey, seek to understand before you're understood and then be understood. That is so true for both sides. And so what are you seeing as well? Now I'm hearing from, since I work with a number of Indigenous communities, and I hear on the topic of procurement that it can be very difficult because the bids go out of the corporation, sorry, one sec, and on, okay, these are the products and services that we need filled by the Indigenous community that we're working within. Here's all of the numbers. Can you give us the people that can deliver? And the challenge is there's a gap there, because in many cases, there's either not enough entrepreneurs that can deliver those products or services, or there's just not enough training provided. Yeah. So, and then you've got the whole cultural component on top of that, around the understanding, each side understanding each other. So what are you seeing happen in that area? What's the current state of affairs there?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's safe to say that, never before have as many businesses been looking to hire from the Indigenous community, which is good, right? Both job seekers and entrepreneurs. As you mentioned, I think some things that we definitely need to keep in mind are the gaps and the shortcomings when you're talking about supply and demand. Again, be it whether from the job seeker side or from Indigenous procurement as a, let's say, supplier.
Right.
Right. So for example, there's still some noticeable, there's still a noticeable shortage of Indigenous candidates vis-a-vis specific roles. And this is certainly a function of the many unfortunate socioeconomic conditions many Indigenous people find themselves in.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's getting better, but as you said, I think both sides need to understand the types of jobs that are available, what
Mm-hmm.
needs to be done to increase the number of applicants to said roles.
Mm-hmm.
And this applies to the entrepreneur as well, right?
Of
So
course.
um, understanding what products and services are, you know, always quote unquote in demand,
Mm-hmm.
um, and which will be in greater or lesser demand in the future.
Right.
Um, Now, something I believe that is helpful to both sides is something that you touched on, which I think is something that needs to be uh, the very first step um, in an attempt to lessen any friction points down the road
Mm-hmm.
to address bottlenecks sooner than later.
Sure.
And that is with respect to cultural nuances and understanding where each side is coming from,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so
Absolutely.
I think one way I like to describe this philosophy would be to say businesses in corporate Canada are very used to B2B, right? Business to
Mm-hmm.
business.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, not many businesses in Canada are familiar with like the true nitty gritty, um, I the true kind of nitty gritty reality of dealing with First Nation communities.
Sure.
Um, and oftentimes it's just purely because they're not aware of the different cultural nuances, what to expect, what not to expect, so on and so forth. So I think before a business even goes too far with a certain project that involves the Indigenous community, what they first need to do is, instead of thinking about things from a B2B perspective, to think about things more from a B2C perspective,
Mm.
business to culture,
Yes.
right?
Point.
And the way I like to explain that difference of B2B versus B2C is the Indigenous communities, and I'm saying communities plural,
Mm-hmm.
so many of them across the country, but they're all different,
Mm-hmm.
right? The communities on the West Coast
Sure.
are hugely different from the communities in Manitoba.
Mm-hmm.
They speak different languages, they have different protocols, so on and so forth, right? So it's literally a different culture. And most of the times, a lot of the reserves are geographically somewhere else.
Right.
So therefore, um, it would be helpful for a business to think, if I went to India
Mm-hmm.
or Russia to
What
do
would I?
business,
Sure. I would
exactly,
need to learn the culture. I would need to learn how people see certain
yeah,
things to do with business. Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely.
The protocol, right? Pick up a
Yeah.
couple basic phrases, this, that,
Sure.
and the other, do's
Mm-hmm.
and don'ts. So,
And
so
that goes for both sides, right?
it does,
Let's,
yeah,
yeah,
it
right.
it it does
Super
because
important.
yeah, it does because from the business point of view, um, it's just like going to another country to conduct business,
Mm-hmm.
and to your point, and I mentioned earlier as well, it's a two-way street. So if this idea of B2C versus B2B is, welcome
Mm-hmm.
as a new mindset when dealing with the Indigenous community, because it's certainly welcome in the business community if they go abroad.
For sure.
Like, why would it be different, right?
That's
But
right.
um, it's important also for the Indigenous community to familiarize themselves a little bit more with how, the non-Indigenous side of things works, what their expectations are, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yes, just like if you were to go for a job interview at any company for that matter, the whole the whole idea is you have to understand what's important to that company. What are they seeking to achieve? What kind of culture do they have? You know, what is it that the employer is looking for when they're hiring? So that you can understand them in order to speak their language. And so, you know, the same is true for going into an Indigenous community. Like, who are they as people and what's important to them? And how do we have a meeting of the minds? How do we make it a win-win for everybody involved?
We all need to be working more closely together. So.
Right. Understanding each other.
Yeah.
And moving forward together. I like it.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Sherman. You've provided a lot of really great food for thought that everybody can take away from today, and that we can all consider how we're going to move forward together into making the Indigenous business industry so much stronger and corporate Canada so much stronger. So thank you very much for being here, and we look forward to having you back.
Thanks for having me, Loa, and it was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sherman. And to all of our viewers, everybody who's watching now, thank you so much for tuning in. And if you liked what you heard today, as well as the other Indigenous entrepreneur videos that we have on this YouTube channel, please do hit the subscribe button below. And we look forward to virtually seeing you again soon.